Alright, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to complete the data fetching pattern by doing for the server side what we just did on the client side. Rendering a complete blog in the HTML leads to a much faster experience of loading for the end user. It may also have positive effects on search engine rankings. We're going to start where we left off in the last episode. If you need to catch up, get checkout Redux server. So currently when we run npm run dev, we can pull up our article post. If we look at the source, we can see it's not being rendered on the server yet. So inside the server code in render.js, you can see we're dispatching an action that's supposed to fetch the article. And we're doing so before we send the response. So why doesn't the store full of our information? The reason is the response is going to send back this HTML before dispatch finishes fetching the article. To solve this problem, we need to incorporate promises into our render. So how do we do that? First, fetch article currently returns nothing. If you can see, fetch article calls fetch, has a series of promises, and then dispatches further actions. These actions then update the store. So we're not actually returning anything in the fetch article. That is, of course, if there's no site and slug. It'll return undefined. So what we need to do is make this function here into a promise. And we can do that with our async await keywords. It's to say async in front of the function. Now inside this async function, we should change these promises to use the new await syntax. So if we delete this, we can say something like const response equals await fetch. And so that'll wait for the fetch to finish before it assigns the result to response and moves on to the next line. So in the next line we can say const items equals await response .json. So this is going to do the same thing and turn everything into JSON. So now we can call dispatch with our fetch success function. And we can pass it our items. We can wrap this in a try block. And then we can have dispatch fetch error and pass it the error. So this is the full async await version of what we had before. Now let's put a debugger in here. Let's fire this up and see what happens. It's giving us a regenerator runtime is not defined error. So this will happen if you're using async await, but you haven't installed the right Babel plugin. So let's do that now. So now we need to npm install Babel plugin transform async to promises. And inside of our Babel RC we'll say transform async to promises. Alright, so now if we rerun our server, we can see it works again. Not too bad. So now that we've made fetch article asynchronous, let's create some functions so that we can call these things in the proper order as they load. So first, let's create a load article function. We'll pass it the site and the slug. And the contents will simply be to return store dispatch. So now let's turn this res send into something else. Let's actually take that off. And so it's just a template literal now. Around that we can create a function. Let's call it template. So this is going to return the template literal. Now what we can do is we can set up an if statement. It says if request path matches article, then we want to return a promise from load article, passing it the site and the slug. So we can say, we can call then on that promise. And it'll run this function after the data has loaded. So here is where we say res send and then the template. If we're not doing article, we can just say res send template. So we're either sending the response after the promise or we're just sending the response. Alright, so now let's reload our source to see if it worked. And it worked. Pretty simple. So we have all of the rendered content inside the source itself, as well as within the client. So let's look at the network tab for a second. You can see we're pulling in a full JSON response of the article with every load, even though it already exists on the page. So there's a way around that. We can render the data on server render and then place it into the store before the client ever has a chance to do its own fetch. So if we said something like script, then inside here, set the window initial state equal to JSON stringify store get state. So what happens to our source code? We see that we have the full content rendered out in the initial state variable. So now that window initial state is full, as soon as the page loads, we can use that inside app.js. So right here, we can pass window initial state. And because configure store has an initial state variable that fills up its create store, from the very beginning the store will have all of the information on the article. And if there is no article, it actually has the error information. So now when we reload, we're still pulling down this information. Now why is that? Well, in article.js, you can see that we're calling this no matter what on component did mount. If you recall, we also had a problem where if we click to article 2, it doesn't really change. We have to go back to about and then click article 2 and then it changes. So that's because the component did mount is only mounting article once. And every time we switch to article 2, there's no remount. So component did mount needs to change. It needs to be component will receive props. And that gets the props. So let's switch this props to just props within this function. So now when we rerun this, so now you can go back and forth from component will receive props. It's pulling in the information on every load. But is it still pulling in on the first load? We can see from the network tab that it seems that it's not. That's good enough for me. Alright, so lastly, I want to set up the routes a little differently so we can still use our draft articles. Let's go to the routes file. And inside here we have article 1 and article 2, as well as the route article. So let's copy the route article and make a new one. We'll call it draft. And then this will be draft article. So up here in the links, let's create 2 more. And these will point to draft, post, and post 2. So now let's click to draft 1 and draft 2. On mine it says not found. Let's check it out. I see. So props params is props match params slug. Everything else looks good. So now we have our draft 2. Right on. So what if we went to link post 2 and started editing? It updates in line. Pretty cool. Alright, so we did it. We have a fully working blog with articles, a way to draft articles, and an about page. Everything renders on the server side and reloads on the client side. Even the draft renders. It's pretty amazing. You'll notice the window initial state does not render. And that's because we're not calling load articles. But why is this appearing on our draft? Well, if you look at draft, it's because we're using require. And we can pull the markdown data from the require and inject it into draft article before we render it. It's all included in the draft article bundle. If you look at draft article.js, you can see all of our posts are included. And so that's why it's able to render them, even though we're not calling load article. Now draft article can get a little bloated, but it's useful for right now so we can see our posts as we edit them in a WYSIWYG style. Alright, so that's it for this episode and this section.
If you need to catch up, check out Redux Server Final.
If you want more information on building up a markdown blog or adding anything else to Webpack, please let me know. Future episodes will include deeper dives into building your own loaders and plugins, WebAssembly, and pushing this to production with SSL. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.